Money usually buys silence, yet Richard Bennett discovered it couldn't buy a verdict. He strutted into court, wearing a $5,000 suit, smirking at his trembling wife, Sarah. He didn't just want a divorce. He wanted total destruction. Armed with high-priced sharks and falsified documents, he planned to paint the mother of his children as unstable to strip her of custody. The gallery held its breath as Richard took the stand, confident he had won. But he made one critical mistake. He underestimated the judge. What happened next wasn't just a legal ruling, it was a public execution of an ego. To understand why the courtroom gasped that day, you have to understand the decade of silence that came before it. Sarah Bennett wasn't born into money. She was a scholarship kid from a rusted-out town in Ohio who clawed her way into Northwestern University. That was where she met Richard. Back then, Richard wasn't the king of futures, as the Wall Street Journal would later call him. He was just a hungry, aggressive analyst with a chip on his shoulder and a terrifying amount of ambition. They married in 2012 at a vineyard in Napa. It looked like a fairy tale, but even then, the guests noticed something off. During the toasts, Richard didn't speak about Sarah's kindness or her brilliance. She was a certified CPA, after all. Instead, he bragged about acquiring the best woman in the room. He talked about her like she was a vintage Porsche he'd just won at auction. Sarah's sister, Molly, would later testify. For 10 years, Sarah played the role. She quit her job at Deloitte to manage their sprawling estate in Lake Forest, Illinois. She hosted the galas, managed the contractors, and raised their 2 children, Leo and Sophie. To the outside world, they were the Bennetts. Untouchable, glamorous, and deeply in love. But inside the mansion at 440 Sheridan Road, the air was thin. Richard's control was absolute. He didn't hit her. He was too smart for bruises. Instead, he used money as a weapon. Every credit card purchase, over $50, triggered a text alert to his phone. If Sarah bought groceries that were too expensive, she'd get a call within minutes. "Why are we buying organic strawberries, Sarah?" he'd ask, his voice calm but icy. "Do you think money grows on trees? Or are you just stupid?" He eroded her piece by piece. When she suggested going back to work, he laughed. "Who would hire you? You've been out of the game for a decade. You're a glorified babysitter now, Sarah. Just be grateful. I pay the bills." By 2023, Richard's net worth was estimated at $45 million. But Sarah didn't have access to a dime of it. She had to ask him for cash to pay the housekeeper. She had to beg for tuition checks. The breaking point didn't come with a shout, but with a whisper. It was a Tuesday in November. Sarah was in Richard's home office, dusting the mahogany bookshelves, when she saw a file left carelessly on his desk. It was labeled Project, Clean Slate. Thinking it was a new business venture, she opened it. It wasn't about stocks. It was a dossier. There were surveillance photos of her taking the kids to school. There were printed emails between Richard and a woman named Veronica discussing apartment listings in Miami, and there was a draft of a legal document. It was a prenup. But they had never signed a prenup. As she read closer, her blood ran cold. It was a post-nuptial agreement, dated 5 years prior, with her signature at the bottom, a signature she had never written. Richard wasn't just planning to leave her. He was planning to frame her. The dossier outlined a narrative he was building, that Sarah was an alcoholic, that she was neglectful, and that she had signed away her rights to the marital assets years ago. She was holding the blueprint of her own destruction. At that moment, the front door slammed downstairs. Richard was home early. Sarah shoved the papers back into the folder, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She barely made it out of the office before he walked up the stairs. "What were you doing in there?" Richard asked, loosening his tie. He stared at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. Just cleaning," Sarah stammered. Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You look pale, honey. Maybe you should lie down. You've been looking so tired lately, almost manic." He was already starting the script. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She knew she couldn't confront him. He was too powerful. He knew judges. He knew senators. He played golf with the district attorney. If she fought him, he would crush her. But looking at her sleeping children, she knew she had no choice. She needed help. But how do you fight a war when your enemy controls the supply lines? Sarah knew she had to move fast, but Richard moved faster. 3 days after she found the file, Sarah went to the bank to withdraw cash for a consultation with a divorce attorney. She slid her debit card to the teller. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Bennett," the teller said, frowning at the screen. "This card has been declined." "That's impossible," Sarah said, her hands shaking. "Try the joint savings." "The account is frozen," the teller whispered, looking around nervously. "It's flagged for suspicious activity." Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a text from Richard. "Stop embarrassing yourself at the bank, Sarah. Go home." He was watching her. He had alerts on everything. She rushed to her car, panic setting in. She drove to the elementary school to pick up Leo and Sophie, thinking she would take them to her sister's house in Ohio. She would just run. But when she pulled up to the pickup line, the principal, Mrs. Higgins, was waiting by her car. There was a police cruiser parked behind her. "Sarah," Mrs. Higgins said gently, placing a hand on the car door. "You can't take the children today." "What are you talking about?" Sarah screamed, stepping out of the car. Parents were watching. Heads were turning. "There's been an emergency order filed," the officer said, stepping forward. He looked apologetic. "Mr. Bennett filed an ex parte motion this morning. He claims you are a flight risk and potentially under the influence. We have orders to release the children, only to the father." "I am sober," Sarah yelled, tears streaming down her face. "He is lying. He's trying to steal them." "Ma'am, please lower your voice or I will have to detain you," the officer warned. Just then, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up. Richard stepped out. He looked devastatingly calm. He walked past Sarah, as if she were a stranger, nodding to the officer. "Thank you for keeping them safe, officer," Richard said smoothly. "I'm sorry it came to this. My wife, she hasn't been herself." "Richard, look at me," Sarah begged, reaching for his arm. He flinched away theatrically. "Don't touch me, Sarah. You need help." He took the kids. Leo looked back at his mother, confused and scared, as the electric locks of the Mercedes clicked shut. Richard drove away, leaving Sarah standing in the school parking lot, sobbing, while the other moms whispered behind their hands. He had stripped her of her money, her reputation, and her children in under 4 hours. Defeated, Sarah drove to the only place she could go, a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, paid for with the emergency $50 bill she kept in her glove box. She sat on the stained bedspread, staring at the wall. She had nothing. Richard had won, or so she thought. The next morning, she went to the legal aid clinic downtown. The waiting room was packed. She waited 6 hours to see a junior lawyer who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "Mrs. Bennett," the kid sighed, looking at her intake form. "You're up against Richard Bennett? The Richard Bennett of Bennett Cromwell Holdings?" "Yes," she whispered. "I can't help you," the kid said, closing the file. "His firm donates to this clinic. It's a conflict of interest. No big firm in Chicago will touch this. He's probably conflicted them all out already." "So that's it?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow. "I just lose?" "Not necessarily," the kid said, lowering his voice. He scribbled a name on a sticky note and slid it across the desk. "There's a guy. He's unconventional. He used to be a big-shot corporate litigator until he got disbarred for punching a judge. He got his license back 2 years ago, but he works out of a strip mall now. He hates guys like your husband." Sarah looked at the name. Arthur Artie P. Caldwell. She found Artie's office, sandwiched between a vape shop and a laundromat. The sign on the door was taped up with duct tape. Inside, the office smelled of stale coffee and old paper. Arthur Caldwell was sitting behind a desk buried in files. He was 60, overweight, wearing a rumpled suit, and eating a sandwich. He looked at Sarah over his reading glasses. "If you're here for the slip and fall at the grocery store, I told you, we need the security footage," he grunted. "I'm Sarah Bennett," she said, standing tall. "Richard Bennett is trying to destroy me. I have no money, I have no kids, and everyone tells me you're the only one crazy enough to fight him." Artie stopped chewing. He wiped his mouth with a napkin and leaned back. The name Bennett clearly rang a bell. Richard Bennett, Artie mused. The guy who shorted the housing market in '08 and bragged about evicting grandmas. That's him. And he took your kids? Yesterday. Artie looked at her for a long moment. He saw the designer clothes that were slightly wrinkled from sleeping in a car. He saw the terror in her eyes. But beneath that, he saw the steel of a woman who had survived 10 years in a shark tank. I don't work for free, Mrs. Bennett, Artie said. I know where he hides the bodies, Sarah said. I found a file, Project Clean Slate. I know about the offshore accounts in the Caymans. I know about the shell companies he uses to dodge taxes. I can't access them, but I know they exist. Artie's eyes gleamed. A shark smells blood, but an old wolf smells a hunt. Sit down, Artie said, kicking a chair toward her, and tell me everything about this clean slate. While Sarah was strategizing in a strip mall, Richard was celebrating. He was at a steakhouse with his lawyer, a man named James Sterling, a $500 an hour predator known as the Grim Reaper of divorces. She has nothing, Richard, Sterling laughed, swirling his scotch. We froze the assets. We have the emergency custody order. The judge assigned to the preliminary hearing is Judge Miller. I play golf with Miller. He hates weeping women. She's going to come crawling back, Richard said, cutting into his steak. I'll give her a small allowance. Put her in a condo. Let her see the kids on weekends. But she needs to learn her place first. What if she gets a lawyer? Richard laughed. I checked. She went to legal aid. They turned her away. She's radioactive. Nobody wants to go to war with me. Richard was right about most things. He was rich. He was powerful. But he made the classic mistake of a narcissist. He assumed his victim was stupid. And he had no idea that Sarah hadn't just hired a lawyer. She had hired a man who had been waiting 20 years for a chance to punch a bully in the mouth, legally speaking. The battle lines were drawn, but the first skirmish wouldn't happen in a courtroom. It would happen at the deposition. And Richard was about to walk into a trap so humiliating, he wouldn't even see the floor dropping out until it was too late. The deposition was scheduled for a bleak Tuesday morning in December inside the glass-walled conference room of Sterling, Finch, and Associates. The skyscraper offered a panoramic view of Chicago, a visual reminder of the city Richard Bennett believed he owned. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a simple navy blazer Artie had found for her at a thrift store. Armor, he had called it. Don't look like the victim. Look like the CEO of your own life. Artie arrived 2 minutes late. He stumbled into the room, carrying a battered leather briefcase that looked like it had survived a war, and a Dunkin' Donuts cup that was precariously full. Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by James Sterling and 2 junior associates. They looked like a phalanx of sharks in Italian wool. Richard didn't even look up from his phone when Sarah entered. Mr. Caldwell, captor, Sterling said, his voice dripping with disdain. So nice of you to join us. I trust traffic wasn't too difficult for you coming in from... Where is your office again? The suburbs? Strip mall, Artie said cheerfully, setting his coffee down on a coaster. Next to a vape shop. Great parking, though, Richard snickered. The dynamic was set. They thought Artie was a joke, a bottom-feeder lawyer for a desperate woman. The court reporter swore Richard in. The videographer adjusted the camera. The red light blinked on. Mr. Bennett, Artie began, shuffling through a stack of disorganized papers. I'm just a simple guy, so forgive me if I ask some dumb questions. I just want to understand the finances. Ask whatever you want, Richard said, leaning back and winking at Sterling. I have nothing to hide. Artie spent the first hour asking inane questions about household expenses. He asked about the cost of lawn care. He asked about the price of the kids' piano lessons. Richard grew visibly bored, answering with monosyllables, rolling his eyes at the camera. He was relaxed. He was arrogant. Then, Artie dropped a piece of paper. He bent down to pick it up, groaning slightly, and when he came back up, his demeanor had shifted, just a fraction. The bumbling uncle was gone. Something sharper was behind the glasses. Mr. Bennett, let's talk about your assets. You listed your primary holdings as Bennett Cromwell and a few diversified mutual funds. Is that correct? Yes, Richard said. And you have no other business interests? No other, let's say, limited liability companies? None that are active, Richard replied smoothly. Artie adjusted his glasses. Okay, so you've never heard of a company called Aurora Borealis Consulting? Richard didn't blink. No. What about Redstone Logistics? No. Okay, one more. What about Blue Heron Holdings? The room went silent. For a split second so fast you'd miss it if you weren't watching. Richard's jaw tightened. It was a micro-expression of fear, but he smothered it instantly. Blue Heron? Richard scoffed. Sounds like a bird-watching club. No, I have no knowledge of any entity by that name. You are under oath, Mr. Bennett, Artie said softly. I want to be very clear. You are stating for the record that you do not own, control, or have any beneficiary interest in Blue Heron Holdings? Asked and answered. Sterling barked. Move on, Caldwell. You're fishing. I'm answering, Richard interrupted, leaning into the microphone. I do not know what that is. My wife, however, has a vivid imagination. Maybe she made it up. She's been hallucinating a lot of things lately. Sarah dug her fingernails into her palms under the table. He was gaslighting her on the record. All right, Artie said, seemingly defeated. He put a folder away. Let's move to the post-nuptial agreement. Ah, yes, Richard smiled. The document Sarah signed 5 years ago. You witnessed her sign it? I did. In our home office. She wanted to secure her future, in case her substance issues got worse. And you're certain of the date? August 12th, 2018? Absolutely. It was our anniversary. Sad day to sign a contract, but necessary. Artie nodded, looking sad. Okay, no further questions. James Sterling looked confused. That's it? We booked the room for 4 hours. I think I have everything I need, Artie said, snapping his briefcase shut. As they packed up, Richard walked past Sarah. He leaned in close, his cologne suffocating her. That was pathetic, Sarah. Your lawyer is a clown. I'm going to bury you next week. Sarah trembled, but then she looked at Artie. Artie wasn't looking at Richard. He was looking at the court reporter, ensuring the transcript was locked. As they walked to the elevator, the doors closed, sealing them in safety. Sarah turned to Artie. Why didn't you fight him? He lied. I know Blue Heron is real. I saw the name on the bank statement in the clean slate file. Artie pressed the button for the lobby. He finally smiled, and it was a terrifying, wolfish grin. Sarah, rule number 1 of cross-examination. Never catch a liar when he's lying. Let him finish the lie. Let him sign his name to the lie. Let him put the lie in a box, wrap it in a bow, and hand it to the judge. He patted his briefcase. Richard just committed perjury on video. Twice. He thinks he's walking into a coronation next week, but he's actually walking into a meat grinder. The Cook County Courthouse was a fortress of limestone and misery. On the day of the preliminary hearing, the air was thick with freezing rain. Richard arrived with an entourage. Sterling was there, along with 2 junior lawyers carrying boxes of evidence documenting Sarah's alleged instability. Richard looked like a Kennedy. He waved to a few bailiffs he knew by name. He was in his element. Sarah and Artie sat on a wooden bench in the hallway. Sarah was wearing the same navy blazer, her hands clasped tight. Just remember, Artie whispered, don't say a word unless the judge asks you directly. Let me be the bulldog. The clerk opened the heavy oak doors. In the matter of Bennett versus Bennett, they filed in. The courtroom was imposing, smelling of floor wax and old judgments. Richard took the petitioner's table, sprawling out his legs. He nodded at the empty judge's bench. Judge Miller is a good man, Richard whispered loudly to Sterling. Sensible. All rise, the bailiff bellowed. The door behind the bench opened, but Judge Miller, a balding, genial man known for speedy rulings, did not walk out. Instead, a woman walked in. She was 60, with steel gray hair pulled back into a severe bun. She wore reading glasses on a chain and moved with a terrifying economy of motion. She didn't walk. She glided like a predator. Richard's smile vanished. Sterling stiffened. Judge Miller has recused himself due to a sudden conflict of interest, the woman said, her voice low and raspy, like sandpaper on stone. I am Judge Regina Holt. I will be presiding. A murmur went through the courtroom. Judge Holt, the iron gavel. She was legendary in Chicago family law. She was known for two things. She hated time wasters, and she despised men who tried to buy the court. She sat down and looked over her glasses at the two tables. Mr. Sterling, Judge Holt said, not even looking at the file. I see you filed an emergency ex parte order removing the children from the mother. That is a nuclear option. You better have a very good reason for detonating it. We do, Your Honor, Sterling said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. Mrs. Bennett is mentally unwell. We have evidence of alcoholism, neglect, and financial erraticism. We are simply trying to protect the children. Is that so? Holt turned her gaze to Sarah. She looks sober to me. Appearances can be deceiving, Sterling said smoothly. Furthermore, this entire proceeding is largely a formality. Mrs. Bennett signed a post-nuptial agreement 5 years ago, waiving her rights to the marital estate and primary custody in the event of a relapse. Sterling walked up and handed a document to the bailiff. The agreement, Your Honor. Judge Holt took the paper. She read it in silence. The silence stretched for a minute, 2 minutes. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Holt finally said, looking at Artie, does your client deny signing this? Artie stood up. He didn't have his messy briefcase. He had a single, crisp, manila folder. Your Honor, my client denies signing it 5 years ago, Artie said clearly, because that document didn't exist 5 years ago. Richard scoffed audibly. Judge Holt's eyes snapped to him. Quiet. Artie walked to the center of the room. Your Honor, Mr. Bennett is a brilliant businessman. He's very good with numbers, but he's not very good with metadata. Artie pulled a sheet of paper from his folder. We subpoenaed the metadata from the clean slate file Mrs. Bennett discovered. The petitioner claims this contract was drafted and signed in 2018. However, the digital fingerprint of the file shows it was created on November 14th, 2023. 3 weeks ago. Sterling jumped up. Objection. This is ambush evidence. Overruled, Holt said, leaning forward. Keep talking, Mr. Caldwell. Furthermore, Artie continued, his voice rising, Mr. Bennett claims the signature is genuine. We had a forensic handwriting analyst look at it. It's a trace, a digital copy-paste from a birthday card Mrs. Bennett signed for her son in 2019. If you hold it up to the light, you can see the pixelation artifacts. Richard's face went from pale to red. He whispered furiously to Sterling. This is ridiculous, Sterling stammered. My client. I'm not done, Artie cut him off. He turned to Richard. Mr. Bennett, in your deposition 3 days ago, you stated under oath that you had never heard of a company called Blue Heron Holdings. Is that correct? Sterling realized what was happening. He tried to intervene. Your Honor, the deposition hasn't been admitted. I'm admitting it now for impeachment purposes, Artie roared, slamming a transcript onto the judge's bench. Page 42. He denies it. He mocks me for asking. Artie then pulled out a glossy document with a gold seal. This, Your Honor, is the Certificate of Incorporation for Blue Heron Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. The sole signatory and beneficiary is Richard J. Bennett. And what does Blue Heron own? It owns the terrifyingly expensive condo in Miami, where Mr. Bennett has been sending checks to a Miss Veronica Tate for the last 6 months. The courtroom erupted. The gallery, filled with bored lawyers waiting for their cases, suddenly woke up. This was a bloodbath. Judge Holt slammed her gavel. The sound was like a gunshot. She looked at the papers. Then she looked at the metadata. Then she looked at Richard Bennett. Mr. Bennett, Judge Holt said. Her voice was terrifyingly quiet. Stand up. Richard stood up. He was shaking, but he tried to maintain his composure. Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding. My finances are complex. There is nothing complex about perjury, Mr. Bennett, Judge Holt hissed. You looked me in the eye well. You looked the court in the eye and lied about your assets. You forged a legal document to defraud your wife, and you used this court as a weapon to kidnap your children from their mother based on lies. I did not kidnap them, Richard shouted, losing control. I am their father. I pay for everything. She is nothing without me. The silence that followed was heavy. Richard realized too late that he had just screamed at a judge. Judge Holt slowly took off her glasses. You think your money makes you a god in this room? She said. But in this room, I am God, and I am a vengeful God. She turned to the clerk. The ex parte order is vacated immediately. Law enforcement is directed to retrieve the children from whatever nanny Mr. Bennett has dumped them with and return them to Mrs. Bennett's custody tonight. Sarah let out a sob of relief, covering her mouth. Furthermore, Holt continued, her voice rising, I am freezing all marital assets, including Blue Heron. Mr. Bennett, you are hereby barred from accessing any accounts exceeding $500 without court approval. You want to buy a steak dinner? Ask me first. You can't do that, Richard sputtered. I have a business to run. Run it on a budget, Holt snapped. And Mr. Sterling, if I find out you knew about this forgery, I will refer you to the Bar Association myself. Now get out of my sight before I find you in contempt. Richard stood there, stunned. His suit suddenly looked like a costume. The sharks at his table were packing up frantically, trying to distance themselves from the blast radius. Sarah stood up. For the first time in 10 years, she looked at Richard and didn't feel fear. She felt pity. He glared at her, his eyes full of venom. This isn't over, Sarah. You think you won? You have no idea what I'm capable of. Neither do you, Sarah said quietly. Artie guided her out of the courtroom. They had won the battle, but as they walked out into the cold Chicago rain, Sarah knew Richard was right about one thing. It wasn't over. A man like Richard Bennett doesn't accept defeat. He escalates. And now that he had lost his legal weapons, he was going to turn to something much darker. Victory in a courtroom is rarely the end of a war. For a narcissist like Richard Bennett, it was an invitation to change the rules of engagement. For 2 weeks, things were quiet, suspiciously quiet. Sarah and the children were living in a small, 2-bedroom apartment in Rogers Park. It was a far cry from the Lake Forest mansion. The radiator clanked, the windows were drafty, and the view was a brick wall. But for the first time in years, the air inside felt breathable. Leo and Sophie were laughing again. They ate pizza on the floor. They didn't have to whisper. Judge Holt's order had been a sledgehammer. Richard's accounts were frozen. He was on a strict allowance. The king of futures was being forced to live like a peasant, and the humiliation was eating him alive. But Richard wasn't idle. He was festering. On a Thursday night, Sarah received a notification on her phone. It wasn't a text from Richard. It was a notification from her home security app, the one connected to the Lake Forest mansion she had fled. Motion detected, master bedroom. Motion detected, nursery. She watched the live feed, her heart hammering. Richard was there, but he wasn't alone. He was walking through the house with a man Sarah didn't recognize. The man was short, dressed in black, with a shaved head and a neck tattoo. They weren't looking at furniture. They were looking at the walls, tapping them. They were looking for something. Then, the camera went black. Connection lost. Sarah called Artie immediately. He's up to something, Artie. Who is that man? I'm on it, Artie said, the sound of typing in the background. Stay inside. Keep the doors locked. Richard can't touch you legally, so he's going to try to scare you into making a mistake. The psychological warfare began the next morning. When Sarah walked out to her car to take the kids to school, she found a single red rose on the windshield. It wasn't romantic. The petals had been burned black with a lighter. Attached was a note. Enjoy it while it lasts. She drove the kids to school, her eyes darting to every rearview mirror. Was that black SUV following her? Was that man at the bus stop watching? Paranoia is a powerful weapon, and Richard knew how to wield it. That afternoon, the school principal called. Mrs. Bennett, she said, her voice strained. Child Protective Services is here. They received an anonymous tip about bruises on Sophie. Sarah drove to the school like a maniac. She burst into the office to find a stern-looking caseworker interviewing her 7-year-old daughter. Check her, Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face. Check her, right now. There are no bruises. He's lying. The caseworker was thorough. She checked Sophie. There were no bruises, not a mark. The tip was a fabrication, but the damage was done. Sophie was terrified, crying for her daddy because she didn't understand why strangers were inspecting her. This is harassment, Artie yelled over the phone to the CPS supervisor an hour later. This is a weaponized report filed by a vindictive ex-husband. But Richard didn't stop there. 2 days later, Sarah's landlord called. I'm sorry, Sarah. I have to evict you. I got a call from the city inspector. Apparently, the apartment isn't up to code. Someone reported a gas leak and structural damage. There is no gas leak, Sarah cried. I know, the landlord whispered. But the inspector who called me, he mentioned your husband's name. He said if I didn't kick you out, he'd condemn my entire building. I can't fight him, Sarah. You have to go. Richard was systematically dismantling her safe harbor. He couldn't use his money, but he could use his influence. He was calling in favors from every corrupt official he had bribed over the last 20 years. Sarah moved the kids to a motel. She was running out of cash. The frozen assets meant she couldn't get support payments yet. She was bleeding out. Then came the night that changed everything. It was 2 a.m. The motel room was dark. Sarah was asleep between Leo and Sophie. Her phone buzzed. A text from Artie. I found it. Blue Heron isn't just a shell company. It's a laundering operation. I have the ledger. I'm going to the FBI in the morning. We got him, Sarah. We finally got him. Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. This was it. The end of the nightmare. She typed back, Thank you, Artie. You saved us. She waited for a reply. The 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Then, nothing. 10 minutes later, her phone rang. It wasn't Artie. It was a restricted number. Hello? Sarah answered, her voice shaking. Mrs. Bennett? A deep voice. Not Richard. This is Officer Miller with the Chicago PD. I'm calling from the scene of an accident on I-90. Sarah's blood turned to ice. What accident? A vehicle matching the registration of an Arthur P. Caldwell was run off the road. It looks like a hit and run. The car went over the guardrail. Is he okay? Sarah whispered, clutching the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. He's in critical condition, ma'am. He's being airlifted to Northwestern Memorial. We found your number on his emergency contact list. Sarah dropped the phone. The screen cracked on the cheap motel carpet. Richard hadn't just escalated. He had tried to kill her lawyer. Sarah Bennett stood in the waiting room of the ICU, staring at the sterile white tiles. The smell of antiseptic made her nauseous. Artie was in a coma, 2 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and severe head trauma. The police were calling it a road rage incident, but Sarah knew better. You don't run a car off a bridge by accident. She was alone, truly alone. Her knight in rumpled armor was on a ventilator. Her money was gone, her home was gone, and Richard was out there, watching, waiting for her to break. She went to Artie's bedside. He looked small and frail under the hospital sheets. His glasses were shattered on the side table. I'm so sorry, Artie, she whispered, holding his bruised hand. I shouldn't have dragged you into this. She needed to leave. It wasn't safe here. If Richard was willing to kill Artie, he was willing to do anything. She went back to the motel, woke up the kids, and drove. She didn't know where she was going. She just drove north, toward Wisconsin, watching the headlights in her mirror. She pulled into a 2-4-hour diner near the state line at 4 a.m. The kids were asleep in the back seat. She ordered a black coffee and tried to think. Her phone buzzed. It was Richard. Come home, Sarah. Stop this madness. I can make the charges go away. I can make sure Artie gets the best care. But if you keep running, I can't guarantee who gets hurt next. It was a confession and a threat, wrapped in concern. Sarah stared at the phone. She realized then that she had been playing defense the whole time. She had been reacting to Richard's moves. The court order, the eviction, the CPS call. She was just trying to survive. But Artie had found something. The ledger. He said he had the ledger. Where was it? She thought back to the last time she saw Artie. He was paranoid. He carried that battered leather briefcase everywhere. But when the police found his car, they said the contents were scattered. If the ledger was in the car, Richard's men would have taken it. Unless Artie was smarter than that. Sarah remembered something Artie had said during their first meeting. "I don't trust the cloud, Sarah. The cloud is just someone else's computer. I trust paper, and I trust the mail." He had mentioned a safety deposit box? No. He had mentioned a habit. Every Friday, he mailed a copy of his case files to his sister in Naperville. Poor man's copyright, he called it. Ideally, he would have mailed the ledger before he got in the car. Sarah looked at the date on her phone. It was Saturday morning. The accident happened Friday night. If Artie found the evidence on Friday afternoon, he would have mailed it immediately. She had to get to Naperville. She had to get to Artie's sister, a woman she had never met, before Richard figured out where the evidence was. Sarah turned the car around. She wasn't running away anymore. She was driving back into the fire. She arrived at the address Artie had once scribbled down, a small bungalow in the suburbs. It was 6 a.m. She knocked on the door. A woman in a bathrobe answered. She looked like a female version of Artie. Same kind eyes, same messy hair. "I'm Sarah," she said, breathlessly. "Artie's client." The woman's face crumpled. "I heard. Is he?" "He's alive. But I need your help. Did Artie send you a package yesterday?" "The mail hasn't run yet," the sister said. "But he usually sends things via courier if it's urgent." Just then, a blue van pulled up to the curb. Speedy delivery service. The driver walked up the path with a thick, padded envelope. Delivery from Martha Caldwell, from Arthur Caldwell. Sarah felt a surge of hope. This was it. Martha signed for it. She handed it to Sarah. "Take it. Whatever is in there, it's what put him in the hospital." Sarah tore open the envelope in the kitchen. Inside was a hard drive and a stack of printed emails. She scanned the emails. They were between Richard and a man named Vargas. They detailed shipments, not of products, but of waste. Blue Heron Holdings wasn't laundering drug money. It was laundering toxic waste disposal contracts. Richard was being paid millions by chemical companies to dispose of hazardous materials, and instead of processing them, he was dumping them in protected wetlands in rural Illinois and paying off local officials to look the other way. He was poisoning the water supply to buy his Italian suits. This wasn't just divorce court material. This was federal prison material. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "What is it?" Martha asked. "It's the end of Richard Bennett," Sarah said. But before she could move, the front window shattered. A brick flew into the living room, landing on the carpet. Sarah screamed and covered the children. Outside, the black SUV was idling. Richard wasn't waiting for the police this time. He had tracked her phone. He knew she was there. The phone rang in her hand. "Bring the envelope out, Sarah," Richard's voice said, cold and dead. "I'm outside. Just give me the drive, and you can walk away. You can have the house. You can have the custody. I just want the drive." Sarah looked at the terrified faces of her children. She looked at the evidence in her hand. She knew he was lying. If she went out there, she would never come back. He couldn't leave a loose end. "I'm calling the police," Sarah said. "I own the police in this town," Richard laughed. "You have 2 minutes before we come in." Sarah looked around the kitchen. There was a back door. Beyond it, a fence. Beyond that, a neighbor's yard. "Martha," Sarah said, her voice eerily calm, "take the kids. Go out the back. Run to the neighbors. Call the FBI, not the local police. Tell them you have evidence of a federal environmental crime." "What about you?" Martha asked, grabbing Leo and Sophie. "I'm going to buy you some time," Sarah said. She grabbed the envelope, but she took the hard drive out and slid it into the waistband of Sophie's pajama pants. "Sophie," Sarah said, gripping her daughter's shoulders, "do not lose this. Give it to the nice man in the suit when he comes. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mommy," Sophie cried. "Go." Martha and the kids ran out the back door. Sarah stood in the living room. She put the empty envelope on the table. She picked up a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. She walked to the front door and opened it. Richard was standing on the lawn. He looked impeccable in his trench coat. Beside him was the man with the neck tattoo. "Smart girl," Richard smiled, seeing the envelope in her hand. "Bring it here," Sarah stepped onto the porch. The rain was falling again. "You want it?" she shouted. "Come and get it." She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the bait, and she was praying that the FBI was faster than the monster walking up the driveway. The freezing rain of the Illinois suburbs didn't just fall, it stung. Sarah Bennett stood on the porch of the small bungalow, the wind whipping her hair across her face, watching the man who had tormented her for a decade walk up the driveway. Richard didn't run. He didn't look worried. He walked with the terrifying, casual arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. He stepped onto the porch, his Italian leather shoes slick with mud, and looked at Sarah not with anger, but with a pitying smirk. To him, she was still the terrified housewife he had controlled with credit card alerts and gaslighting. He saw the envelope in her hands and assumed surrender. "You always were too sentimental for your own good, Sarah," Richard said, his voice smooth even over the sound of the storm. He reached out a hand, palm up. "You really thought a strip mall lawyer and a folder of stolen papers could take down a man like me? I built this city. I own the people who run it." Sarah clutched the padded envelope to her chest, her knuckles white. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she forced her feet to stay planted. "You tried to kill him, Richard. You ran Artie off the road. You tried to murder an old man because he found your ledger." Richard shrugged, a gesture of chilling indifference. "Artie had a tragic accident," he said, stepping closer, invading her personal space. "Just like you're about to have a very unfortunate mental breakdown. It's a sad story, really. The grieving ex-wife who just couldn't handle reality. Now, give me the drive, Sarah. Don't make me take it from you." "It's over, Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with adrenaline. "It is," he agreed. He lunged. It wasn't a playful grab, it was an assault. He seized Sarah's wrist, twisting it with a cruelty that made her cry out in pain. He ripped the envelope from her grasp, shoving her hard against the vinyl siding of the house. Sarah slid down to the porch floor, gasping, clutching her wrist. Richard stood over her, tearing the envelope open with savage triumph. He reached inside, ready to crush the hard drive between his fingers. His hand came out empty. He froze. He looked into the envelope, shook it upside down. Nothing fell out but a few raindrops. "Where is it?" Richard hissed. The mask of the sophisticated billionaire dropped, revealing the feral, desperate animal beneath. He grabbed Sarah by the collar of her coat, hauling her up. "Where is the drive, Sarah? Who did you give it to?" Sarah met his eyes. For the first time in 10 years, she didn't look away. "It's gone, Richard. It's already on its way to someone who doesn't play golf with your friends." Richard raised his hand, his face purple with rage. He was going to hit her. He didn't care about the witnesses anymore. But the blow never landed. The night suddenly exploded. Floodlights from the street blinded them, turning the rain into sheets of white fire. The deafening chirp of sirens erupted from every direction, not the wail of a local patrol car, but the guttural, rhythmic growl of federal vehicles. "FBI, drop the weapon. Get on the ground. Now." The voice was amplified, booming like thunder. Richard froze, his hand still raised in a fist. He blinked into the lights, disoriented. I have friends in the bureau," he shouted at the blinding lights, his voice cracking. "This is a mistake. Do you know who I am?" A figure stepped out from behind the lead SUV, flanked by a tactical team with rifles drawn. It was Agent Miller, not the imposter on the phone, but the real deal, a veteran of the Environmental Crimes Task Force, who had been building a case against Blue Heron for months, waiting for the final piece of the puzzle. "Richard Bennett," Miller shouted, walking up the driveway, with handcuffs already in hand. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to violate the Clean Water Act, RICO violations, witness tampering, and the attempted murder of Arthur Caldwell." Richard was tackled. There was no dignity in it. 3 agents slammed him into the mud of the front lawn. His $5,000 bespoke trench coat was ruined, smeared with the dirt of the suburb he despised. As they zip-tied his hands behind his back, he twisted his head, spitting mud. He looked up to see the front door of the house open. Martha Caldwell stood there, holding Leo and Sophie. Sophie was safe, holding the hand of a female officer, and in Sophie's other hand, glinting in the strobe of the police lights, was the silver hard drive. Sarah stood on the porch, watching them drag him away. He screamed at her threats, pleas, curses, but the heavy door of the armored van slammed shut, silencing him forever. 3 months later, the final hearing did not take place in the small, chaotic family courtroom. It was held in the Federal Dirksen Building in downtown Chicago. The atmosphere was sterile, serious, and final. Richard sat at the defense table. The Italian suits were gone. He wore a bright orange jumpsuit, his hair graying and unkempt, his wrists shackled to his waist. He looked smaller, deflated, like a balloon that had lost its air. Judge Regina Holt had been granted special jurisdiction to oversee the final dissolution of the marital assets before Richard was transferred to a maximum security penitentiary to serve his 15-year sentence. Mr. Bennett, Judge Holt said, looking down at him over her spectacles with undisguised disdain, the criminal courts have dealt with your freedom. I am here to deal with your empire, or what's left of it. Richard looked up, a faint glimmer of his old arrogance returning to his eyes. He leaned into the microphone. The prenuptial, the original agreement, it protects the core assets of Bennett Cromwell. Sarah gets the house, sure, but she doesn't get the company. The corporate charter is ironclad. It's in a trust. She can't touch it. Even in chains, he believed he had won the money. The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The rhythmic whir, click, whir of an electric wheelchair filled the silence. Artie Caldwell rolled in. He was wearing a neck brace, and his arm was in a sling, but his eyes were sharp and bright behind a new pair of glasses. He rolled up to the plaintiff's table next to Sarah. Actually, Your Honor, Artie rasped, his voice damaged but steady. We found something interesting during the forensic audit of the Blue Heron accounts. A little detail Richard forgot about. Artie nodded to Sarah. She stood up, smoothing her skirt, and handed a single, yellowed document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. 12 years ago, Artie explained to the silent courtroom, when Richard was just an aggressive analyst, he wanted to incorporate Bennett Cromwell, but his credit score was garbage because of a failed gambling stint in Vegas. The banks wouldn't touch him. Richard went pale. He remembered. He needed a guarantor with perfect credit. Artie continued, grinning. So, he used Sarah. She co-signed the original incorporation papers, but here is the twist. The bank required the guarantor to be the majority shareholder of the parent company until the loan was fully repaid and a transfer of ownership was filed with the Secretary of State. Artie paused for effect. Richard paid off the loan, sure, but he was so busy setting up shell companies in the Caymans to hide his money that he forgot to file the transfer paperwork, removing Sarah as the majority owner. We checked the state records yesterday. Legally, Your Honor, Sarah Bennett hasn't just been his wife for 10 years. She has been his boss. Judge Holt looked at the document. She read the fine print. A slow, satisfied smile spread across her face. It appears Mr. Caldwell is correct, Judge Holt said, slamming her gavel down with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. The court finds that the entirety of Bennett Cromwell Holdings is, and always has been, the property of Sarah Bennett. Mr. Bennett, you are not leaving this marriage with a trust fund. You are leaving with a bus ticket to federal prison and a canteen account balance of 0. Richard screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound, the sound of a narcissist realizing he was truly, finally powerless. He lunged at the table, but the marshals were on him instantly, dragging him out the side door as he kicked and wailed. Sarah didn't look back. She gathered her files and walked out of the courtroom, Artie rolling beside her. They exited the courthouse into the crisp Chicago afternoon. The sun was shining, the air smelled clean. So, what now, boss? Artie asked, adjusting his neck brace. Sarah looked up at the skyline. She saw the office towers where Richard had plotted against her. Now, they belonged to her. Now, Sarah said, smiling, we go get the kids. We sell off the luxury cars. and we use that company's billions to clean up every single wetland Richard poisoned. We're going to spend the rest of our lives fixing what he broke. Richard Bennett thought money could buy him immunity, but he forgot the most important rule of all. The person you underestimate is the one who will eventually take you down. Sarah didn't just survive his humiliation. She used his own arrogance to inherit his empire and send him to a cell where his millions couldn't save him. It just goes to show that the truth has a way of coming out, especially when you have a judge like Regina Holt and a fighter like Artie Caldwell in your corner. If you found this story of justice served as satisfying as we did, please hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel bring more of these incredible, real-life dramas to light. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that bullies never win in the end, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a twist. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.